All right, so now we get into muscle origin, insertion, and action. Now, when we're looking at the forearm, wrist, and hand, there are a lot of new muscles. However, the thing I'm going to point out is don't get frustrated. One of the biggest things is to group them together by action and location. So you'll see when we talk about all of these different muscles, if you look at some of their actions and locations, particularly some of the origins of them, you're going to start to see a very common trend. So keep that in mind as you're kind of going through all of these, that, that it'll help you keep them ordered a little bit more while you're studying. Again, even though there is a lot of muscles in this area, there are some real easy things to help you remember some of this. So again, part of this terminology is key. Action and address are often in the name. So when you look at this, so carpi refers to the carpals or metacarpals. So if you hear in the name the word carpi, that means that you're usually looking at some sort of muscle insertion or origin in the carpal or metacarpal bones. Digitorum refers to the digits, phalanges 2, 3, 4, and 5. Pollicis refers to the first digit or phalange 1. So again, if you look at these names, you will often see there will be some connection to a part of the location of the muscle. So again, something to help you remember something about the different muscles. So we look at the muscles. So again, the extrinsic muscles of the wrist and hand are grouped according to function and location. So the following muscles move the wrist, but not the phalanges. So these are wrist muscles that move the wrist joint. So the 3 wrist flexors, the Flexor Carpi Radialis, the Flexor Carpi Ulnaris, and the Palmaris Longus. So you already know what the action of these are for 2 out of the 3 because the action's in the name. So you know that they flex the wrist. Okay, their flexor, again, they have the name flexor right in there. The Palmaris longus is the only one that does not have the action in the name. The 3 wrist extensors, you have the Extensor Carpi Radialis Longus, the Extensor Carpi Radialis Brevis, and the Extensor Carpi Ulnaris. So again, the action is in their name. So that kind of gives you something to kind of look at when you're, again, being able to remember these. So while there's a lot of them to remember, if you look at the names, it tells you a lot about their location. And they're not only their location, but also their action. So a little bit of both. Okay, the phalange extensors, the Extensor Digitorum, the Extensor Indices, the Extensor Digiti minimi, the Extensor Pollicis longus, your thumb extensor, and Extensor Pollicis brevis, another thumb extensor. Okay, again, the action is in their name. You also have abduction of the thumb and wrist with the abductor pollicis longus. So again, you're looking at names. The names tell you something about the action and location and what the muscle actually affects. So the following muscles are primary movers of the phalanges: your phalange flexors, your Flexor Digitorum superficialis, your Flexor Digitorum profundus, and your Flexor Pollicis longus. So the pollicis refers to the thumb. Now, because of the fact they do cross the wrist joint, they do get involved in wrist joint actions. However, they're generally much weaker in wrist joint actions. Okay, so they cross the wrist joint, so they could possibly create action at the wrist. However, the action there is generally much weaker. So again, origin, action, and insertion. Again, lots of new muscles, but again, look at the names and see ways that you can either group them or remember them. Obviously, again, the action of a lot of these is going to be pretty simple to remember because the action's in the name. So the Flexor Carpi Radialis muscle, okay? So flexor, okay? Flexor, we know it flexes. Okay, it's going to flex the wrist. Carpi, well, it's going to insert on the base of the second and third metacarpal on the anterior surface. It has to be on the anterior surface because it produces flexion. Its origin is up at the medial epicondyle of the humerus. The Palmaris longus. Now, the Palmaris longus is going to be the one wrist flexor that doesn't have flexor in the name, but it's a Palmaris longus, so it's going to insert on the palmaris aponeurosis, which is basically a thick band of tissue in the palm of the hand. Okay? Again, the origin is the medial epicondyle. So what are we starting to see? The flexors are in the medial portion of the elbow and forearm. Again, medial epicondyle. So this is the same origin as the Flexor Carpi radialis muscle that we saw on the previous slide. The Flexor Carpi ulnaris. So before we even get into the name, where is it originating from? It's originating on the medial epicondyle of the humerus and the proximal portion of the ulna. So there is a little bit of an attachment on the ulna, but you're still noticing that as a flexor muscle, it's on the medial side of the elbow and forearm. Okay, it's another thing that you will see with that. Okay, its insertion, Flexor Carpi ulnaris. So we know that it's going to be on the ulnar side of the wrist and hand. So here's the ulna bone here. It's on the ulnar side, Carpi. Okay, again, fifth metacarpal, pisiform and hamate. Okay, so when you hear carpi or carpi, that's when you're looking at it's going to be on either the metacarpal or the carpal bones. Okay, and you see the actions as well. So again, the action is obviously flexion. It's also going to ulnarly deviate, whereas any of the radial muscles will also radially deviate. So keep that in mind as you're going through your actions. So again, what do these have in common? So think of the different things that they had in common that I just pointed out. So note those things right now. Okay, pause. You could pause the video a little bit if you'd want, but make note of those common things that I pointed out as we went through the video. Okay, now we look at the extensor carpi ulnaris muscle. Okay, so again, look at the name. Extensor, we know it extends. Carpi, we know that it's going to come down to the carpal, the metacarpals and carpal bones. And ulnaris, and it's going to be on the ulnar side, so we know it's also going to do ulnar deviation. So now what we notice with the extensor muscles, look at where the origin is. So in this case, for the extensor carpi ulnaris, we have the lateral epicondyle of the humerus and the middle 2/4 of the posterior border of the ulna. So we look at this now, when we look at the extensors, they tend to be on the lateral side of the elbow and forearm. Okay, so flexors are on the medial side, extensors are on the lateral side, and you can see this on yourself. We actually call, when you look at if you flex your wrist and you look at the anterior surface of your forearm, you see that little bit of shortening muscle that tightens up in your forearm. That's your flexor mass. You kind of pronate your forearm and you extend your wrist. You see a kind of a clumping of muscle on your lateral forearm shorten. That's called your extensor mass. So on the lateral surface is where you see that. Okay, and then again, always note your origin, insertions, and actions. You're going to insert on the base of the fifth metacarpal on the dorsal surface. So it has to be on the dorsal surface in order to do wrist extension. Extensor carpi radialis brevis muscle. Okay, again, lateral epicondyle of the humerus. So you're seeing that. Again, lateral side, okay? Now there's no other origin on the forearm like the extensor carpi ulnaris. This is just on the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. Inserts on the base of the third metacarpal. Does extension and abduction or radial deviation of the wrist. I have the Extensor Carpi Radialis Longus. So why is it called the Extensor Carpi Radialis Longus? Well, because it's longer than, so if you have a longus and a brevis, the longus muscle just means that, just the longer muscle, okay? Brevis is the shorter muscle. If you look over here, the origin still on the lateral epiconda of the humerus, but you also have in the lower 1/3 of the lateral ridge, okay? But it's still on the lateral side. Okay, so on the lateral side with the other extensors, this one comes down to the base of the second metacarpal. So now think of the things that these three muscles have in common, or these three muscles have in common. Okay, so you should be able to list three things. So I'm not going to tell you, I want you to think, what are the three things that these muscles have in common? All right, going up into the fingers, the flexor digitorum superficialis. So if it flexes, where is it going to come from? Well, it's going to come from the medial side again. So it's still an extrinsic muscle. Comes from the medial side. So you see the origins over here. Now there's some multiple origin points, but again, primarily on the medial side. Medial epiconda of the humerus. You know, ulnar head, medial coronoid process, radial head, upper 2/3 of the anterior border of the radius. So you actually have two different heads to the origin here. The insertion, it splits tendons, attaches to the side of the middle phalanx of the four fingers. Okay, so on the palmar surface. So it attaches to the middle phalanx of the four fingers. So phalanges 2 through 5. And you're going to do flexion of the four fingers along with weak flexion of the wrist. It does cross the wrist joint, therefore it's going to contribute to wrist flexion. The flexor digitorum profundus, again, we're looking at the medial side, so the origins, the proximal 3/4 of the anterior and medial ulna. Now the insertion here, so this is an important distinction. So the flexor digitorum profundus goes to the base of the distal phalanxes, okay? So you get an insertion at each of the four fingers at the base of the distal phalanxes. So remember, the superficialis goes to the the middle phalanx. Okay, it goes to the middle phalanx if you go back to the superficialis. This goes to the distal. Okay, so the flexor digitorum profundus, if you isolate that, you can isolate the profundus by keeping the PIP in extension and then just flexing the DIP. Okay, if you want to isolate the flexor digitorum profundus. Okay, again, here you're getting flexion of the fingers and also some weak flexion at the wrist. Your flexor pollicis, again, you can see your origin. Okay, so the middle anterior surface of the radius and from the anterior medial border of the ulna, just distal to the coronoid process. So again, it's still primarily looking at the belly of the muscle is still primarily on we look more on the medial side. And again, flexion of the thumb. So flexor pollicis longus. It's going to go to the base of the distal phalanx. Again, take your time looking at these pictures. You can pause it. You can, note, look at the illustration. Look at a comparison to your textbook. Again, your textbook is set up a little differently, but it's just to give you kind of another visual anatomically of the muscles. So you could still go along with your textbook, find the different muscles, and pause these videos as you're going through them. So again, what do these three muscles have in common? So the extensor digitorum muscle. So now we're going back to the extensor part. So again, for extension, it's got to go to the posterior or the dorsal surface of the hand. Okay, we're looking at the fingers. Digitorum's referring to the fingers, the lateral four fingers. So it's an extensor, so we're looking more at the lateral side. The origin's the lateral epicondyle. The insertion is going to be the tendons to the bases of the middle and distal phalanges of the four fingers. So this muscle has an insertion at both. It has different insertions on the middle and distal phalanges of the four fingers. And much like the flexors, you're also going to get some weak wrist extension with these. Again, not a primary wrist extensor, but you will get some wrist extension because it can cross the wrist, or it does cross the wrist. The extensor indices, so this is referring to, so the indices is referring to your index finger. So this is a muscle that individually will extend the index finger. So middle to distal 1/3 of the posterior ulna, so it's a very small muscle. You can kind of palpate its action if you just extend your index finger, you can kind of feel it. And it inserts at the base of the middle and distal phalanxes of the second phalange. Okay, so your second phalange, your index finger, the extensor indices. And then the extensor digiti minimi muscle. So it's going to go to the fifth finger. So think of the fifth finger. It's the smallest of the fingers, the minimi. So you look at the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and it's going to go to the base of the middle and distal phalanxes of the fifth phalange on the dorsal side. Extensor Pollicis, so we're back over at the thumb. So the origin is the posterior lateral surface of the lower middle ulna, and it's going to insert on the base of the distal phalanx of the thumb, again on the dorsal surface. And then when you have a longus, you have a brevis. So the brevis is going to be the shorter muscle. That's going to be on the posterior surface of the lower middle radius and insert on the base of the proximal phalanx of the thumb. Okay, so it's a shorter muscle. It's the brevis. If you have a longus, you have a brevis. It just means one's longer than the other. So if you go back, when you go back and look at these, okay, or pause and just go back and look at the previous muscle. So if you look at the origin and insertion of the longus, look at the origin and insertion of the brevis, you can see how it would make sense one's longus, one's brevis. One's a longer muscle. Okay, kind of and extends a much larger surface area. So again, what do all these extensors have in common? Okay, so think of the common things between the extensors to help you remember them. Now, the intrinsic muscles of the hand, and if you look, there are quite a few intrinsic muscles of the hand. So I'm not so much, this is the one situation where I'm not worried about you knowing the exact origin and insertions, okay? But we still want you to know kind of the general location along with. So this is one where you could just know the general location and know the actions of the muscle. So we could be a little more general here because of the proximity of all these muscles within the hand. So for the extrinsic muscles, know all the origin, the detailed origin and insertions. For the intrinsic muscles, we're just going to break these up into kind of two larger groups of muscles, and as long as you know the actions and kind of what muscles are responsible for the actions in those areas, that's all we're concerned about. So for instance, here we look at what's called the thenar eminence. Okay, so if you look at your hand, okay, with your palm up, kind of right at the palmar surface of your first metacarpal, so that's the metacarpal with your thumb, you have kind of that big sort of pad of muscle on your hand. That's the muscles responsible for abduction, opposition, flexion, and adduction of the thumb. That's called your thenar eminence. Okay? So the thenar eminence is that muscle, or is that landmark, okay? That's where those muscles are responsible. The hypothenar eminence is the muscular pad that forms the ulnar border. Okay, so again, looking at your palm, kind of spread your fingers out. Again, you could feel the thenar eminence at the base of the thumb. It's that pad right at the base of the palm of your hand. And in the hypothenar eminence, you run along the ulnar aspect of your hand on the palmar surface. That's what's called the hypothenar eminence. And the muscles there are responsible for abduction, flexion, and opposition of the fifth phalange. Okay? So those are the intrinsic muscles that we're concerned with you knowing right now in the hand and where they're located. So that kind of wraps up the wrist and hand. Again, you know, there's a lot of muscles in this region, but again, if you look at the names, that does kind of tell you. Now, there is obviously more details with regards to the specific origin and insertions, but again, if you start with seeing the names and understanding what the names mean, that kind of gives you some insight as to where those are located.